For the fifth time this month, a red flag warning issued in parts of North Georgia, and this episode of seeing critical fire weather is not expected to immediately turn off as we turn the calendar to the end of March. Joining me now to talk about why the fire conditions are so prime across the Appalachians and the Piedmont is Andy Snyder, a meteorologist with the National Park Service. Thank you for joining me today.
You bet.
So, Andy, today you issued a fuels and fire behavior advisory that highlights a big area throughout North Georgia up through the Appalachians for really critical fire weather through the end of March. Can you talk to me about why we're in such a time right now that fires can spread quickly?
Yeah, there are definitely a number of reasons. If you look at some of the meteorological data from late February through March, most of our observation sites across the Appalachians have observed the lowest mean relative humidity since at least 2010. If you look at some of the longer standing sites such as ASOS and some of the airports around the region, they are the driest. It's essentially the driest March we've ever seen, going back to the 1940s at least for a lot of stations across the Appalachians. So we have all the dry air. We've had a number of dry cold fronts pass through, probably more so than we would typically see this time of year. Those have resulted in those dry and windy days. Otherwise, Helene is definitely adding to some of the impacts, particularly across northeast Georgia. Essentially anywhere that was along to the east of Helene's track has excess fuels from all the trees that were torn down. So there's a lot of leaf litter, there's a lot of twigs that have cured out and are burning now. And then eventually down the road, we'll see some of the larger trees that were knocked down add to the fire intensity as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. So today's actually the 6-month anniversary of Helene's landfall. And as it came through, as you were mentioning, just right of the center of the path, there was incredible tree destruction. How does having all of that tree and tree twigs and everything come down 6 months ago contribute to fuels for the fire? Like, how does that help the fire spread quicker?
Yeah, there's a few things going on. So one of the problems is that we were still had most leaves on the trees then. Some were, of course, stripped off by the strongest winds, but those trees that were knocked down, pine trees and hardwood trees, kept some of their leaves on. And so those were lofted. They're drying out more quickly than they would be if they were on the ground. Say they got soaked in rain, it takes a little bit longer for them to dry out. So that's part of the problem. You also have all of those dead trees. So essentially the finer fuels such as the leaves, the smaller twigs, those can dry out much more quickly. I've already cured out since Helene impacted the region. It'll take some of those heavier fuels quite a bit longer. Sometimes it takes several years for the really large trees to dry and cure and become burnable. That will really contribute to some increased fire intensity and potentially faster fire spread once we get into the fall fire season this coming year and then fire seasons down the road. One of the other major issues we're having, direct attack, so where firefighters go in and try to create dozer lines around fires to help stop the spread. Those are more difficult to do now because there's so much destruction in the way of those bulldozers that they're not able to get through it, or they need larger equipment to be able to do it. And then on top of that, there were a number of landslides there, a few in northeast Georgia, but more so just to the east where the most significant flooding occurred. That washed out bridges and roadways, washed out trails, and contributed to some weakened hillsides that could potentially be a hazard issue for firefighters and heavy equipment. So a lot of different things going on. Right now, it's the finer fuels that are mainly contributing to the intensity of these fires.
Very, very thorough explanation there. So in a sense, if you had to summarize all that in kind of like 30 seconds, you're saying that we have conditions that are really dry outside right now. And talk to me more once again really shortly about how Helene bringing all those trees and fine twigs and leaves down is contributing to the worst fire weather outside.
Yeah, sure. So we're thinking of this as the whole fire environment. So you have all of the debris that was knocked down by Helene's winds that is contributing to the amount of fuel that we have available to burn. On top of that, we've had an extremely dry late February and March, pulling all that moisture out of those twigs and leaves that are on the ground or that are lofted in the air. The drier those fuels are, the more likely that they are to burn once we get some critical fire weather in the region.
And you mentioned the firefighting strategies changing a little bit. How do firefighters train for that? I know your expertise is meteorology, but is that something where they can bring in training from other parts of the country, do you think?
Yeah, certainly. So firefighters from all over the country are already responding to the large fires that are ongoing there in Northeast Georgia, up into the Carolinas. Some have responded elsewhere in the Southeast. One of the strategies that they use in this case, would be indirect attack. So essentially, they're using air resources, helicopters, large planes, large air tankers, bring lots of air equipment in since they can't reach some of the fires on the ground, especially where that destruction is most severe. And so there's a lot more aircraft in the air around these fires.
Andy Snyder with the National Park Service, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today on why things are so critical now and worse than other Marches because of all the extra fuels on the ground and all of those dry fronts passing, dropping the humidity. You have been an incredible resource for us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.